Today Matter.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to take part in the colloquium, which is really a great learning process for me. When I was asked to look at this particular topic, I must say this is something that I had not focused on in my previous research on UDI. My work primarily comes from my PhD, which focuses on the financial aspects of Rhodesia's UDI. And in looking at these issues, I focused particularly on the role that a Ministerial Economic Coordination Committee performed during the period 1965 to 1979. And in this context, it was really a domestic role whereby the MECC, as a cabinet committee, was central to coordinating, the financial aspects of the different ministries of the Rhodesian regime. So, looking at Anglo-Portuguese relations is something that was a bit of a challenge initially, particularly because I make reference to the Lisbon, Pretoria, Salisbury axis in my work, but have never really focused directly on, these kind of diplomatic issues that took place. So when I ventured out to do this research, I discovered that there is very little work on Anglo-Portuguese relations, save for a few works, for example, by Sue Onslow. I didn't get access to one of the chapters that I wanted to read. Yes, but we've discussed that, so that is in the works. But I did get to use some of her work, including the article, I think in 2005, Question of Timing, South Africa and Rhodesia's UDI, in which elements of Rhodesian Portuguese relations are examined. But when I ventured out to look at this, I had to really look at so many texts about Portuguese history itself, and of course, the establishment of Portuguese-Rhodesian relations historically. And that's how I ended up having to structure my paper, because for us to sort of appreciate the nature of the relations that I established in the 1960s, I think it was a personal thing. I wanted to sort of understand and kind of put this down on paper, the relations as they were established from the colonial period. Now, I'm not going to dwell much on what happened in the pre-colonial period. That is something that other people have examined. But the long and short of it is that, there were colonial contests between the British and the Portuguese over Zimbabwe, with the BSAC even attempting to secure Portuguese territory in parts that were managed by the chartered companies in Mozambique. So the relations did not start off on a good note. But what we do see is that as the colonial period progresses, the global changes that take place begin to sort of shift the nature of relations between Portugal and, I suppose, Portuguese East Africa before 1950. And the number of things that do take place is the fact that, by 1923, Southern Rhodesia becomes a self-governing colony. And by 1925, there's a regime change after a period of turmoil in Portugal itself, establishing, I think with the coming in of Antonio Salazar, I think in 1933, the Estado Novo regime. And with that, we begin to see some kind of changes within Portugal itself. So as the colonial period progresses, particularly the period after the Second World War, there are so many global changes that have taken place, resulting in a situation where Britain's imperial influence starts to sort of wane in the post-Second World War period as it moves from its position at the apex of the international financial system. And this is important when considering that when Rhodesia attained that self-governing status, it had assumed that naturally it would proceed to dominion status. But what we have in the post-Second World War period is a kind of second colonial occupation. And in that context, I suppose the colonial state kind of continued to accommodate imperialism, hoping that at some point they would attain this kind of status. But given the changes that were taking place within Portugal itself, we begin to see a reorientation of these kinds of relations, such that by 1950, when Portugal sort of reorients its approach to its colonies and removes this idea that it has colonies, but begins to look at its colonies as part of its pluricontinental state, we begin to see sort of relations, economic relations, developing even further. Now, the kind of relations that we're talking about are certainly different from the relations that Rhodesia had with South Africa. Those are well documented. Professor Ian Phimister, Professor Alois Mulambo, and numerous other scholars who just had another presentation on the kinds of relations that Rhodesia had with South Africa. There were all these custom union negotiations, that took place over the time. Before 1950, the relations between Southern Rhodesia and Portuguese East Africa were limited, for example, to issues of labor supply. For example, the involvement of the British South Africa Company in railway construction. But after 1950, we see a sort of a shift. And this is particularly because of Southern Rhodesia's settler interest. And in the 1950s, I think the first kind of agreement that they seem to have had was on the Beira Convention, which is touted as having influenced the kinds of agreements that then developed further, including on intelligence issues involving the FIS, the Federal Intelligence and Security Bureau. And ultimately, as the Federation proceeds after it is established in 1953, particularly after the coming to power of Welensky, settler interests in trying to attain dominion status become even more evident. Now, in this context, one of the main worries was that, Britain was demonstrating increasingly that it was not going to sort of hold on to colonies, especially after Macmillan came to power in 1957. Now, making reference, for example, to Matthew Hughes' work on fighting for white rule, which examines the Federation, Katanga, and the Congo crisis, he discusses how Roy Welensky was at the heart of trying to sort of negotiate the expansion of the Federation to include Katanga and Mozambique in that sort of expanded federal state. And he tried to convince both the Americans and the British as to the need to do this, obviously making reference to Cold War issues that were beginning to intensify at that time. Now, in this context, this is when we begin to see the first agreement being signed between Southern Rhodesia and Mozambique in 1959, and Portugal in 1959. And although this agreement appeared initially on paper to be beneficial to both countries, it had many aspects of it, when you look in the documents that I looked, that were very restrictive. Particularly when it came, for example, to the importation of timber products, for example. Those timber products imported into Rhodesia were not supposed to sort of compete with a growing manufacturing industry there. So the restrictions were such that the timber products that had to come in had to be in a sort of raw state and not processed in any way. So it was a very restrictive trade agreement for all intents and purposes. And amongst the Rhodesian politicians, there was also a lot of talk about how to sort of frame the kind of relations that they were going to have. We have to keep in mind the fact that these were very different colonial systems, and with sort of different interests except in the pursuit of white rule. Where Rhodesia was hoping to gain dominion status or ultimately gain independence from Britain, Portuguese actually wanted to retain its colonies under the guise of it being a purely continental state. Now, this leads me to the kind of developments that take place in the late 1950s towards the 1960s, whereby Welensky's efforts ultimately became overtaken by events, especially when the reports about whether federation could be kept or not came out in 1960. It was clear that it was doomed to collapse. And of course, the kind of state that he was hoping to create in Central Africa could no longer be sustained. So, as the federation was dissolved, these critical questions about the future of particularly Southern Rhodesia became key for both Rhodesia and Portugal. Zambia and Malawi had been key to Portuguese strategic interest in terms of retaining its colonies, especially given Zambia's proximity to Angola, for example, and the fact that Angola was becoming surrounded by independent states. Now, if you notice the discussion that I've had right up to the late 1950s, early 1960s, economic issues were not as dominant as much as political, strategic, and security issues. It is only in the 1960s, in fact, after the dissolution of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, that economic issues become very prominent. The question of how Rhodesia was going to survive for the Rhodesians, as a white-ruled state in Central Africa, was critical, and especially given the loss of Zambia and Malawi. And these questions were also important to the Salazarist regime in Lisbon as well. And it was in this context that the Rhodesians started making efforts to try and secure not just its borders in security terms, but its economy as well. Because if it was going to rebel, it needed to have a functioning economy that could finance its rebellion. Now, they created the Southern Rhodesian government after the election of the Rhodesian Front in 1962, and especially after Smith took over in 1964. They created a committee that would sort of try to secure trade agreements with many different countries prior to 1965. And I argue in my work that as soon as Smith took over, it was clear that Rhodesia was proceeding towards the decision to go for a unilateral declaration of independence. Now, in as much as they secured many agreements with a number of countries, including some European countries as well, France, Germany, and others in Africa as well, including in West Africa, and Zambia for that matter, and Malawi, one of the key partners that they needed to bring on board was Mozambique itself. Now, this was because of Mozambique's access, through Beira, particularly because it would be cheaper and easier to bring in supplies from that front as opposed to bringing them in from South Africa. So Mozambique was key to Rhodesian plans for UDI. And in the same context, Rhodesia was also critical for Portuguese plans to retain both Angola and Mozambique, which were very important colonies to Portugal itself. So, of course, although Smith did pass through Lisbon, meeting with, Salazar, all of the developments leading up to the agreement that was ultimately signed in 1964 was done with South Africa's sort of collusion. As of course Onslow has noted, for South Africa it really was a question of timing. They did not want to be seen to be supporting UDI, although it is something that they were hoping would occur. We do see a situation whereby whatever meetings that took place, even when a Rhodesian delegation ultimately subsequently visited Lisbon after Smith had gone there, they sort of went there and they always informed Pretoria of what they were organizing. Now, the first delegation was led by George Radland to sort of work out the kind of agreement that they needed to put in place. Remember, I had said this would be the first sort of comprehensive trade agreement that they would sign, especially given the restrictions of the 1959 trade agreement. And when they went there, they needed to have teams that would sort of work on these issues. The visit to Portugal was then followed up by a visit by a delegation led by General Bento to Southern Rhodesia to sort of work out the kind of trade agreement that they needed to come up with. Now, despite the fact that Portugal's economy had somewhat improved under the Salazarist regime, it still faced a number of economic problems of its own. And in this context, I think I must say that South Africa, therefore, still had that position of being the bigger financier within the axis of the Rhodesian rebellion itself. But nevertheless, the role of the Portuguese trade agreement is important in the sense that it established Portuguese colonies, particularly Mozambique, as the back door to Rhodesia's international trade. Now, what is important about this trade agreement is, for me, not so much about the kind of agreements that they made, especially given that the nature of the trade itself, the goods involved in the trade, Rhodesia would have sort of the better advantage, especially given that it had created a functional manufacturing sector which was still growing at this time. And it gave Rhodesia access not just to Mozambique but to Portugal, and some goods would be exported directly to Angola, and some goods would be exported directly to Portugal itself. But for Portugal, the question was not so much about the economic as much as it was for the strategic interests. Now, given my take and my look at how, finance was crucial to funding the Rhodesian rebellion, the way I look at it is that for Southern Rhodesia, it was both strategic and economic. Now, if you look at the nature of the people who ended up getting involved in Rhodesian trade, it wasn't just the Portuguese. It gave French, German, Americans, and numerous other people access to Rhodesian goods. In the same way that it gave them access to sort of continue trading these goods. So a lot of the goods that were then produced in Zimbabwe would then be exported either via South Africa, repackaged, or via Mozambique, where they would sort of change the place of origin and then export it out into the world. Now, this is, of course, following UDI, and I think, of course, I've read some of the papers here, so I don't want to preempt them, but in one of the papers, particularly your paper, Eddie, there's a suggestion that, and what Professor Shubin said earlier, that, it was more of a performance, the sanctions that were imposed on Southern Rhodesia. No, it was more moralistic than it was pragmatic, and nobody really observed them, both in 1966 and in 1968. And in this context, in order to sort of allow that kind of, moral picture to work, everybody ignored the kind of, busting of sanctions that was occurring outside of Mozambique. So it sort of shifted attention from sanctions busting activities for obvious reasons. And in this context, I think Southern Rhodesia also viewed Portugal as particularly strategic because of the kinds of relationships that it had with some of these countries that were, forcefully pushing for sanctions against Rhodesia itself. Now, the trade agreement helped Rhodesia, at least until, as far as I can tell, the mid-1970s, starting from 1972 onwards. In this context, we can't look at Portuguese Rhodesia trade agreements without also looking at the trade agreement that they reached with South Africa in 1964, because it was also part of a similar package. But of course, the 1964 agreement has been examined by a number of scholars who have not given much attention to the Rhodesia trade agreement. Now, a lot of people attribute the success of sanctions busting activities to South Africa's involvement, which is not untrue. But at the same time, my work discovered that it wasn't just about South Africa's involvement, but it was also about the nature of global trade in the mid-1960s to the late 1960s. There was a commodities boom at the time, and therefore Rhodesian goods had wide access to the international markets, and they made quite a killing from that. I'm saying this acknowledging the fact that although the Rhodesian economy developed through the work of the MECC itself, there was also quite a lot of financial injection coming from South Africa itself. But my argument in this paper is that none of that would have been useful as long as the Eastern Front was not open. So for that reason, I find that to be strategic. It is in the 1970s when Portuguese colonies step up their war effort, I suppose, and as well as when you begin to have the kind of global events that shift the global economy. For example, the Nixon shock of 1971, which sort of misaligned Rhodesia's economy when you try to look at the impact of the Nixon shock in the Rhodesian economy itself. Remember, what was supposed to sustain the Rhodesian economy was a strong financial base based on a delicate management of foreign exchange in the country. Now, when Nixon moved off gold in 1971, that had a direct impact in Rhodesia as it did elsewhere. And for me, that sort of was the beginning point at which Rhodesia's fortunes began to turn. However, it was in the same year, of course, that we had the Byrd Amendment, which kind of helped Rhodesia to stay afloat a little bit more. But without the Byrd Amendment, I think the Nixon shock would have had serious effects to the Rhodesian economy itself, despite having this trade agreement. In 1972 and thereafter, we have a situation whereby events in in Portugal are also beginning to change. One key issue is the discussions that they had with Guinea-Bissau over its independence, which Caetano then sort of moved back on. And when he did that, he started a process that ultimately led to the revolution in 1974, where a lot of people within Portugal were willing to allow Cape Verde to sort of proceed to a kind of self-rule, which would put less pressure on the decolonization of Mozambique and Angola. He initially agreed to it, but when he moved back on the agreement that they had made, this created a lot of opposition to him internally. So, with all that political conflict taking place in Portugal itself, with the resumption of the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe from December 1972 onwards, with the impact of the global recession emanating from the Nixon shock and the oil price hikes of 1973, for me, I think from that point on, the price of sustaining the Rhodesian rebellion had, really escalated. And of course, the story about what happens in Portugal, with the Carnation Revolution, everybody knows about that, I think. And this led, of course, to the collapse of, to the independence of Portuguese colonies then. Also, crucially, when these events were beginning to take place, we also begin to see a shift in South African attitudes towards Rhodesia, particularly under Vorster, who, having sort of read the signs of those times, began to sort of side with the Americans, the Zambians, the British, to try and work out a resolution where they were willing to kind of sacrifice Rhodesia to try and retain apartheid, white rule in South Africa. So for me, these are the issues that make up the sort of Rhodesian-Portuguese relations. It was a strategic agreement for Portugal. It was an important economic agreement for Southern Rhodesia to make Mozambique Rhodesia's backyard to international trade. And it was important in the sense that not only did it provide an eastern front for strategic security reasons, it also provided an eastern front that sustained the Rhodesian economy and sustained the Rhodesian rebellion for as long as it did. Thank you. Oh.
Tinashe, thank you very much for your paper. I wondered whether it was possible, and the numbers may not exist for this, but is it possible to put kind of numbers of dollars on this, and let's say what proportion of Rhodesia's economy was facilitated by that route through Mozambique that you're talking about, as a way to sort of see in hard numbers the impact of that?
Mm-hmm. All right. Yes. At the moment, what I have is coming from the research I did, at Rhodes, at the Corey Library with the Smith papers, some of the material from here in Pretoria and some from the Bank of England. And from the material that I have, I didn't quite come across those numbers, but I suppose this is where I kind of need Sue. But they would certainly help in illuminating what value the trade agreement in itself had. But for me, I don't think it's a question of just the numbers themselves. Because remember, the Smith regime, of course, never really, it dealt, it had many underhanded dealings, and I don't think a lot of those numbers would be available. So for me, it's a question of how they utilize the agreement that they had with Portugal to sort of keep the Rhodesian economy moving, but certainly the numbers would aid our understanding better of what was taking place. Yeah.
Not really a question, it's a comment. I think it's kind of difficult for you to get those figures. Because I think from about 1968, 69, the region stopped publishing their trade figures. So the only way you can reconstruct that is to see the amount of goods that reached markets like Japan and all that, which you can then recalibrate in the sense that sometimes they say we imported $200 million of some material from South Africa. When South Africa shows only exported 50 million.
Yeah.
And that difference shows you that something is going on here. And you could do that maybe for Mozambican trade as well, but it's very difficult.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. Or at least from the documents I have. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you.